Today I'm going to analyze the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster as an emergency management failure. With this presentation, I'm trying to find out if we can analyze the disaster through some management tools to make sense of what's happened and how could it have been mitigated. So, very brief summary about the Fukushima disaster. Fukushima, the nuclear power plant, was subject to an earthquake followed by a tsunami in a difference of 1 hour back in March 11th, 2011. This disaster led for the earthquake led for an immediate shutdown, programmed shutdown for all the units. However, this shutdown did not complete properly after some flooding and some damage to the structure with a level 9 of an earthquake, plus the high levels of tsunami. The tsunami flooded the area with unexpected levels of flooding that reached more than 14 meters at the maximum peak of the tsunami. That led for some power distribution to be submerged by water and not function properly. Some backup batteries did not function. That's led for the cooling systems to fail and for some systems to explode by hydrogen explosions. Now, that catastrophe led for leakages and radioactivity in the water, along with lots of consequences that was catastrophic enough to evacuate people from the nearby area and to lead to lots of socio-technical consequences that led to shutting down many of the nuclear plants for inspections and for safety upgrades. And one point of a time, all nuclear plants were shut down for maintenance or for decommissioning within the last 3 years. Nuclear energy accounts for almost 30% of the energy for Japan. So who are the stakeholders here? After going through a very basic balance scorecard evaluation of what kind of performance measures that could have been accounted for this, I identified 4 team members or 4 stakeholders. We have the people of Japan and residents of Fukushima. They've been impacted by evacuation and by losing their houses for almost more than 2 years, along with the water pollution that happened. The Japanese legislator is also a stakeholder here. They formed an independent investigation committee in a ICC that was assigned to and authorized by the legislator to follow up with the tragedy. This was the first time to have an independent committee to investigate, assigned by the Japanese legislator, in the whole constitutional Japan history. Along with that, we have Japanese government. The Japanese government is stakeholders that was influenced by the energy lobby, energy corporations from one side, but from the other side, it was influenced by the energy security and environmental concerns and people concerns. People and voters came into the streets for in a very rare occasion due to the consequences. The last and most critical stakeholder is TEPCO, the Tokyo Electrical Power Company, who was the operator of the plant that was under investigation. The Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission concluded with very important and critical conclusions. Now, this is not to really overshadow the complexity of the concern. The investigators consisted of medical doctors, chemists, journalists, lawyers, and among others in seismology and other fields that is very critical to consider whenever we are studying this problem. The chairman, Kiyoshi Kurokawa, identified very important concerns in the conclusions of their report for the commission. They said that we cannot regard what happened as a natural disaster. It was profoundly man-made disaster. It should have been foreseen and prevented. Moreover, he would say that Japan nuclear industry managed to avoid absorbing critical lessons learned from Three Mile Island and Chernobyl. It became accepted practice to resist regulatory pressure and cover up small-scale accidents. Moreover, he was identifying that bureaucracy and bureaucrats in organizations, they worked for their organization interests more than the prominent duty of protecting public safety. This is very important that they attributed the problem as a man-made disaster. They concluded with reforms that would be needed as a recommendation that should be implemented in reforms in terms of uh, changes of policies and regulations and how regulations work together. Structure and electric power industry should be reformed as well to comply with safety concerns. This is the most important recommendation. We should reform the crisis management system. And from there, I would highlight some failures that would be associated with the four functions. In planning, they did not. The catastrophe went because they did not include conservative parameters for tsunami flooding protection that might have been mitigated the impact of the national disaster. To include conservative parameters for the tsunami flooding protection might have mitigated the impact of natural disaster. That's an or organizing problem that wasn't really taken care of. Bureaucracy and Japanese culture was one of the important factors that led to the catastrophe. It was said that this was solely Japanese problem. It couldn't happen if it was in another culture, or very likely it wouldn't happen because of how the leadership would work in different cultures. The control element is very critical here. This is a quotation from the report mentioning how the relationship and how the cross balance check in between stakeholders didn't really work for the benefit of the public safety. Now, what could be potential or probable solutions? We could either abandon nuclear energy generation in Japan and work on other energies that is less vulnerable to natural disasters. Areas with high vulnerability to natural disasters might be a very bad idea to have nuclear energy in. That might mean shutting off all nuclear energy plants in Japan. That move has been started already in Japan and Germany. There are some people who's pushing for this solution. Other solutions could be to rebuild all reactors or redesign them with higher altitudes or better isolation to mitigate any potential flooding. These solutions might cover some of the effects, or some of them would mitigate some of the problems, but would not prevent it completely. The third solution that I would be in favor of is to establish emergency management plans that have a comprehensive emergency management plan that would consider all options. It would consider A and B as potential options that we can use if we would look into a comprehensive model. This is a comprehensive model that I proposed working on different models of emergency management systems or models where we could work on different functions and see the comprehensive idea of what could happen starting from the planning phase up to the recovery. Now, we would have different perspectives, performance measures. It could be financial, customer, internal processes, and learning and growth. Here are four main perspectives. We have the risk and liability that the company and the government would incur. That's something that they could measure and evaluate how well their plans are reducing the risk and liability. Is the benefits outweighing the costs? In terms of the customer perspective, is there any conformance to safety regulations and standards? How is this level is up to the conformance of regulations of standards? Assuming that the customer, which is people of Japan and residents of Fukushima, require such a conformance. Internal processes perspective, is there effectiveness level of decision making and leadership? How much fast communication could happen to mitigate any problem if it happens? In terms of the learning and growth perspective, is there conformance between standards and findings internationally with implemented practices? Here, I would say that there was the four elements or four performance measures did not really have a high level of magnitude in the before the disaster, and that might lead to the disaster. Now, going forward into the model that I proposed, we would see that the prepare, predict, protect, respond, and recover is a model that might give us a better understanding of how we can mitigate the problem. To conclude, I would recommend that we could have a better idea and better understanding of how the problem happened if we would help people to look into the problem not as protection and prevention of disaster, but also predicting how likely the disaster could happen. And that could be a feedback that could control our preparation. We could shut down the nuclear plants if our prediction is that the tsunami or the earthquake could reach more than a scale of 9. What kind of preparation could we do? The wave walls, it wasn't high enough to eliminate the flooding. So our preparations could change. Now, in terms of protection, whenever they are working on protection, would they feed back whatever incidents that could happen after the disaster to predict consequences that happened after the flooding? Many of the consequences and the impact of the disaster wasn't just because of the earthquake. Some of it was because of the earthquake. Some of it was because of the flooding, and some was because of the response that was happening and the lack of protection that was happening even after the incident. So this is to conclude a bigger understanding or a comprehensive understanding for the problem and the relationships between each function and seeing how they would interact together might help us to perform a better evaluation of the emergency management system under consideration, and that might mitigate the engineering failure in mitigating leakage and failure of safety shutdown systems in Fukushima nuclear plants.